Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another tier list using Tier Maker, this time covering the Khorne unit roster tier list. Now, Skarbrand is currently the only faction leader playable for Total War Warhammer 3 at the moment, and you know what Skarbrand hates apart from everything? Well, Skarbrand especially hates paying full price for anything, which is why in his unique trait he reduces the upkeep, the recruitment cost of any units recruited into his army. So this video here is sponsored by Instant Gaming, because you don't have to pay full price for any game, especially if it's already been released. So it's never been easier to browse Instant Gaming. With the easy to use UI here, you can very easily determine exactly what you want, what platform you want to be using, and can be activated in whatever country you're from. It's really important that you get that stuff correct. And then you've just got really great prices here, and Instant Gaming makes it very clear as to whether or not a game is rated particularly well or not. So high rankings, so 10 out of 10 are the highest, whereas 1 out of 10 is like the worst. I have never even heard of Wanderer. And gives you a rough idea of how much you would be saving if you were paying it compared to on full price on Steam. That being said, it's really important before you do purchase on Instant Gaming, do check to see if there is a Steam sale. So if you just check the various different websites out there, you can get yourself a great deal, and that's all I want for you guys, to make sure that you are not paying more than you have to for the games that you play. Anyway, with that being said, let's jump in now to the actual tier list. Big thanks to Instant Gaming, by the way, for being an awesome partner of the channel. It's been a pleasure. Anyway, so moving on to the melee infantry first, we're starting with the mortal units of Khorne here with the Warriors of Khorne. Now these are very basic. There's really not much to say about them. Their utility is one thing and one thing only: they smash. They just go in and they fight. And that's fine in the early stages of the campaign when you're only going up against basic units. But when you start to go up against later game units, I think the mortal units start to drop off in effectiveness. I'm going to be putting all three of them, the Warriors of Khorne, under B tier. Now, the reason for that is that this one here can be recruited without a military building. Otherwise, from a military building, it's tier 2. And these two here are both tier 3. So this one here has no speciality. It's just stats, basically. High armor, good melee stats, relatively decent price. The price doesn't really matter too much with Khorne, because they just make so much money from just killing stuff, assuming you win. So the more armies you have, the more money you make. So the actual cost of units doesn't matter that much, unless you're like really running out. So halberd variant, obviously that's your anti-large. And then you get your anti-infantry variant, so they're slightly better than this one here, but they're also more expensive, so it balances itself out. So it just comes down to whether or not you want to have a slow meat grinder unit, or you want to go with faster damage dealers. Generally speaking, I value much more highly, especially with a melee-focused roster, the ability to kill quickly is better than the ability to hold the line a long time. Generally speaking, if you want high amount of resistance in your forces, you want to have a missile-focused backline, which Khorne doesn't really have, because even the Skull Cannon, which is, well, Skull Cannon and the Soul Grinders are your only missile units. They exhaust their ammunition really quickly. They just don't need to have a meat grinder type unit. That being said, they're like a standard unit. They're not terrible, but they're not amazing either. So B tier for all of their mortal melee infantry. Now we move on to their demon melee infantry, the Bloodletters. These are the guys that I prefer over them, and I reckon that Bloodletters in particular are just really good early game units, because you can recruit them straight away from turn 1. The global recruitment cost isn't that bad, so they're very replaceable. Like they are fairly expensive, but given how much damage that they can inflict, they get that money back, so I feel like they get value. And because Khorne has so much movement range, you sort of just get that value. And there's a landmark that's able to reduce their upkeep cost quite significantly. So these guys here are boosted way more than the mortal units. Also, just to make clear again, this is based around campaign play, not around multiplayer, because obviously that landmark wouldn't make any difference to multiplayer. Generally speaking, all of my videos are not included with multiplayer stuff. I still get people asking, but what about multiplayer? I don't focus on it. You're gonna have to ask someone else, okay? Okay, so back to this. Just a minor disclaimer. So yeah, Bloodletters are awesome because while they don't have as much hit points or armor as these guys here, they're like 50% faster, so they can get into fights a lot quicker. They also have anti-infantry, armor piercing, and magical attacks, so they kill quicker, they maybe die a little bit quicker, especially if you're going up against demons. But if you're going up against mortal units, getting 20 to 30% physical resistance actually accounts for more, I think, than having a lot of armor. So these guys here actually could end up being sturdier for you, if you're depending on what you're going up against. And when it comes down to the Exalted Bloodletter, it is functionally the exact same as a regular Bloodletter. It's just higher stats. You pay 50% more upkeep, and you essentially get a unit that's essentially twice as good. So as soon as you're able to get them, you can go for it. The biggest downside to an Exalted Bloodletter is that they have a base time to recruit of 2 turns, which means globally recruiting them can take up to 4 turns. And that's just a long time to wait for units, whereas regular Bloodletters usually only take 1 turn to globally recruit. Because of bloodletting, you can reduce the global recruit time quite quickly in your armies. So I guess that would also mean that this would be dropped down to like 3 or even 2 turns. But even then, I like to recruit my armies super quickly. Khorne is not the faction to be standing around turtling. You need to build your army quickly and go out and kill quickly, because that's how you make your money. But overall, I think these are A-tier units. Then we've got the Minotaurs. Minotaurs are really good, so I'm going to put both of these under A tier. The Halberd variant, I think it's this one here, has, well, obviously the anti-legend is tier 5, whereas the anti-infantry variant is tier 4 and has anti-infantry. Generally speaking, you can make a complete army of Minotaurs. Minotaurs are really good because of their animations. They charge into melee. They've got a good amount of mass so they can get out of melee very quickly, and they're reasonably quick. The only units that are really able to catch up to them are particularly fast units. But regular infantry just won't be able to handle their hit and runs, so they're able to dish out loads and loads of damage. Very good unit, the Minotaurs. Then we've got the Chaos Spawn. Now, personally, I think Chaos Spawn, from a strategic and tactical point of view, are a terrible unit. So I'm actually going to put it into D tier. The reason for this is because while this is like a good melee fighter, it's not necessarily cheap. And they have Frenzy. Not Frenzy, Rampage. Actually, they might have Frenzy as well. Most Khorne units have Frenzy. So Rampage is probably one of the biggest detriments to a unit that you can have, because it takes a unit out of your control and just basically places it under AI control. Now, these units here, even when fighting amongst infantry, which is where they're ideally used, they can kind of get bogged down and killed pretty quickly because they are very big. They don't have any speciality, and them being unbreakable isn't really that big of a deal with Khorne, since most of Khorne's units have pretty high morale anyway. So this unit here, I think if you want monstrous units, you can't go wrong with the Minotaurs. They massively outclass this one. Even though this one is a tier 3 unit, I would just wait and get to tier 4. I just don't think that Spawn of Khorne are very good at all. It's probably one of the worst spawns out of all the various Chaos Spawns in the game, just because of Rampage. Rampage is such a bad skill, especially when you absolutely need to have full control over what you're doing. Next up, we're moving on to some cavalry stuff. Let's talk about the various crushers. So we got Blood Crushers and Skull Crushers. So you got a demon. So these the Juggernauts are the beast that they're riding. We got Bloodletters riding Juggernauts. So that's a Blood Crusher. And then you've got a Warrior of Khorne riding a Juggernaut. So that's a Skull Crusher. Now I'm gonna put the Blood Crusher at A tier, but I'm gonna put the Skull Crusher at B tier. So I'm going to explain exactly why that is. Generally speaking, for the demons, mortal units are not as effective as their demonic units, because physical resistance is just really good. Now, another thing on top of that is that these have a speciality. They're anti-infantry. They've actually got an anti-infantry bonus. Now, if we just go into Warhammer 3 really quickly here, you can actually see, if you go to this one here, it says anti-infantry. I would highly recommend that all of this information in here you take with an absolute pinch of salt, because sometimes, believe it or not, this game actually lies to you. Now, when it says anti-infantry, that doesn't mean you've got an infantry bonus here. You actually have to have a look at the actual stats. Somebody just typed that in and says, oh yeah, this unit here is good against infantry. But really, it's no different against infantry or or cavalry because it doesn't have any speciality. Whereas this one here is actually anti-infantry because it has an anti-infantry bonus. And in case you're wondering what that actually does, it's a melee attack and weapon strength bonus when going up against small units. So units that have the small icon, this one here is large. So anything that has that particular icon there, you actually have a bonus versus it. So the Skull Crushers actually are not anti-infantry, even though the game says it is. Do not be fooled by the bullshit lies that the game actually feeds to you, because it lies to you in so many different ways. So just be wary of that. I think some people are just way too trusting of the UI in Warhammer 3. So it's not that the Skull Crushers is a bad unit, it's that it costs more, it has higher upkeep, it's not demonic, so it doesn't have that physical resistance. In terms of, oh yeah, but then they crumble instead of routing. Look, these units are so elite that if this one here starts crumbling, it's probably just about dead anyway. These are really strong units. Now, you might also think, oh, but these have a low speed for a cavalry unit, right? You always say you want a minimum of like 75 speed for a cavalry unit. Normally, yes, but because these guys here have so much mass, they're not exactly on the same tier as a horse. So the fact that they're a bit slower, well actually quite a lot slower than some horses in the game, is not that big of a deal because these guys here borderline are monstrous cavalry. They hit so hard that these guys here can actually successfully cycle charge into units because they push everything around so much and actually dish out damage on the charge, unlike, you know, some other types of like regular horse cavalry out there. So yeah, that's what I think about the Juggernaut cavalry. Now move on to the hounds. So we've got the weak corn dogs and then the stronger corn dogs. Basically, we've got the mortal corn dogs, which I'm putting under D tier. These ones here, they only serve one purpose, and that's to run down broken units or to cap points. They're actually very good at capping points, but they are not good at breaking enemy units in the first place, even if you rear charge them. They're not good at dishing out damage, even against lightly armored units. They just get killed really, really quickly. Considering how strong the rest of Khorne's roster is, this guy here is like an outlier as one of the weakest, bar none, units in Khorne's roster. Its only purpose is to run down enemy units. Now, in terms of that, you could just get the demonic version here. So, this one here has no physical resistance, it routes. This one here is an actual demon, and it disintegrates. This one's large, and those are small entities. So there is a bit of a difference between the two, but functionally, their role is the same. Except that the Fleshhounds of Khorne here, they're actually capable of dishing out a decent amount of damage. I wouldn't rely on them as damage dealers, and they should primarily be used to run down broken units. But they do have the ability to actually fight okay. Just watch out for armored units. Non-armored units, other demonic troops, slightly armored demonic troops, the Fleshhounds of Khorne are quite good at dealing with, especially against like the Blue Horrors of Sinch, which the other demonic units in Khorne's roster are actually quite vulnerable to. So I don't mind these, but I don't think they belong any higher than C tier. Next up, we've got the Chaos Furies. I'm not a huge fan of Chaos Furies in general, but Khorne's ones are probably the strongest fighters. Now, you can use Chaos Furies for destroying enemy towers very quickly, so that is a purpose. Another thing is that if you get a whole bunch of Chaos Furies together and put them in one big blob and then land them on an infantry unit, they can just about delete a unit really quickly. I learnt this information from Nerd Rage Fred from one of his videos. But would I rely on doing this? Not really. The Chaos Fury faction is kind of Chaos Undivided, so I'm going to be putting this one at C tier. I don't think they belong at D tier, but yeah, I wouldn't rely very heavily on them. They're just a bit on the squishy side. Next up, we've got Bloodthirsters. So, Bloodthirsters, I want to put them at S tier, and I'm going to put them at S tier, but I need to do like a disclaimer for them. They are very strong, arguably one of the strongest fighters in the game, but currently units that are flying, especially single entity ones, can be a bit derpy when landing, and the Bloodthirsters are no exception to that. Another thing is that this unit here can't heal itself, so there's no magic in Khorne's faction unless you get Bella Core. And, you know, at the end of the campaign, even then, that's shadow magic, so no healing. They're It's completely different when dealing with if you're playing as Chaos Undivided, because then you actually do have magic. But yeah, their biggest weakness is their inability to heal, but they're arguably one of the strongest fighters in the game. They do massive amounts of anti-large damage, and in the late campaign, that's probably going to be the most useful thing in it. And they're still really good at infantry, as long as you don't get completely surrounded by an anti-large unit. They'll do a pretty good job. Watch out for guns and magical bullets, because they'll take down their physical resistance really quickly. But otherwise, Bloodthirsters are super, super strong. Next up is the Soul Grinders. Soul Grinders are also S tier. Excellent unit. You could totally make a doom stack of them. Very, very strong. They've got a missile attack that's okay. It's basically a cannon, and they can also fight in melee. Once again, they can't heal, on the battlefield at least. One of the great things about Khorne is that you do get a lot of regeneration on the campaign map just from being anywhere, because they replenish an enemy territory. But yeah, on the battlefield, there's not much, because healing is really valuable for pushing your balance of power back up, especially with single entities, and Khorne just can't do that. But yeah, the Soul Grinders are very strong. Next up is the Gorebeast Chariots of Khorne. These are particularly good. So this is a chariot unit that isn't particularly fast, and I've always valued speed quite highly. But the thing is, while they don't have a lot of speed, these guys have massive amounts of charge potential and just knockback. These guys just destroy enemy infantry. Now, they're technically a mortal unit, so they don't have access to physical resistance. I'm going to be putting them at B tier. I think they're pretty damn strong, but these ones here outclass them. Now we've got the sort of the specialist single entities. We've got the Skull Cannon, which I'm going to be putting at A tier. I think Skull Cannons are really good, but I wouldn't spam them in your army. You can do it, but be very wary of, I guess, a lot of anti-large. Because these guys here, they run out of ammunition pretty quickly. They can do a fair bit of damage. They're not terrible against single entities either. And they can go into melee and regenerate ammunition and their health. But I think that if you go up against the odds, or if you go up against something particularly fast like Slanesh, this unit here can really let you down. But it is really good if you just get a couple of them. So they're really good in your Blood Host armies. And then we've got the Blood Shrine of Khorne. I'm just going to put this one at S tier. This is one of my favorite units, and sort of like the dark horse of the Khorne roster. This is a really, really good unit because of all the utility. Actually is really boosted by just how Warhammer 3 plays out. So it's kind of like a melee variant of the Skull Cannon, because it regenerates while in melee. They're better melee fighters than the Skull Cannons. It's just that it doesn't have the actual cannon itself, but it doesn't matter too much. But one thing that's really good about, again, about the Blood Shrine and the Skull Cannon is they have a lot of capping power. So these guys here, if you build an army around these shrines, they're actually really good for just going in and just capping points really quickly, because they don't lose capping power as they get damaged, so they retain their full capping power even if they're like down to 1% health, although at that point it's just about dead. So you could split out just a couple of them and just go after the 5 or 6 capping points that you need to go for and just win the battle that way. The ability to regenerate by going into melee is really useful, so once the enemy has run away, you can actually regenerate them. And they provide a pretty decent passive buff around themselves with a leadership and melee attack buff, which doesn't stack. So putting loads of them into one area, you're still just going to get that buff once. It's also a really good mount for the Blood Reapers. So that's my tier list for Khorne roster. I think that Khorne's actually got a very good roster, and prior to Warhammer 3 coming out, I was very critical of Khorne. I thought Khorne was going to be complete shit, but all of his stuff is really strong, and on very hard battle difficulty, because the cheats have been softened quite a bit from Warhammer 2, Khorne is actually quite viable. And if you go up against a battle where you're not quite... it's not quite in your favor, just the sheer strength of your forces can sometimes overcome it, where otherwise other factions just wouldn't have been able to do it. But it is kind of difficult to get like massive heroic victories as Khorne. You know, those kind of victories are reserved for like Cinch, where you go in with like next to nothing as far as the game's concerned and destroy like legions of enemies just using magic. Khorne just can't do that. I mean, Scarbrand can do that, but outside of him, these ones here. They punch above their weight most of the time, but not that much above their weight. Overall, I think Khorne's roster is pretty strong. Anyway, that's the end of this one here, guys. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this tier list. Most of the roster is above B tier, so I think it's like an above average roster. But let me know your thoughts. Appreciate you guys. Don't forget to check out Instant Gaming. Thanks again to them for sponsoring this video, and we'll see you next time, fuckers. Bye.